The air was alive with celebration. Drums pounded in rhythm, voices lifted in joyful song, and the courtyard glowed with bright colors of fabric and bead. Families and friends had gathered from near and far, ready to witness the union of Zahara and Kabelo. It was the kind of wedding that people in the village would talk about for years, a day filled with dancing, laughter, and the promise of a new beginning. Zahara, dressed in a flowing gown stitched with golden patterns, walked with a heart full of hope. For her, this was more than a wedding. It was the dream she had carried since the first day Kabelo promised to love her forever. As she looked at him across the crowd, her heart swelled with pride. Kabelo was her anchor, the man who had chosen her despite every obstacle. She imagined the life they would build together, one filled with love, children's laughter, and quiet evenings watching the sun sink over the field. Everything around her spoke of joy, yet beneath her smile lay a shadow that only she felt. For all the happiness of this day, Zahara could not ignore the one pair of eyes that never softened. Madame Thandiwe, Kabelo's mother, sat in her seat with her back straight and her lips tight, refusing to be moved by the celebration. To the guests, she was a respected matriarch, but to Zahara, she was the silent storm waiting to break. And though the drums beat louder and the songs rose higher, Zahara's heart whispered a warning. Not everyone was here to celebrate her joy. From the very beginning, Madame Thandiwe had never hidden her feelings about Zahara. In her eyes, Zahara was never good enough for her only son. To Thandiwe, Kabelo deserved a wife from a wealthy family, a woman who could bring status and riches, someone who could match the life she dreamed for him. But Zahara was the daughter of a farmer from Lasanda village, a girl who grew up selling tomatoes and vegetables in the market to help her widowed mother make ends meet. To Thandiwe, this was shameful. "A girl who sells tomatoes cannot marry my son," she once said, her words sharp as a knife. Though she said it in private, the bitterness always showed in her eyes whenever she looked at Zahara. At family gatherings, her disapproval was never hidden. She would make small remarks that cut deep but were disguised as jokes. If Zahara wore a new dress, Thandiwe would laugh and say, "It must be borrowed. Surely she cannot afford such things." If Zahara served food, she would comment, "Market hands always smell of onions, no matter how much they wash." These words stung, but Zahara never answered back. She would simply smile, lower her eyes, and carry on. People admired her quiet patience, though some pitied her for enduring such treatment. There were moments when Kabelo tried to defend her, but Thandiwe always silenced him with the authority of a mother. "You do not understand," she would say firmly. "I want the best for you. Marriage is not only about love, it is about family, about respect, about standing among the right people." In those moments, Kabelo would fall quiet, torn between the woman he loved and the mother he could not dishonor. Zahara often cried in private, her heart heavy with the feeling of being unwanted. She could not change where she came from, nor the simple life her parents had given her. Her late father had always told her that dignity mattered more than wealth, and that true love was richer than gold. So she held on to those words whenever Thandiwe's scorn grew unbearable. She chose silence, not out of weakness, but out of respect for Kabelo and for the family she longed to be part of. Still, the pain lingered. Every insult, every cold glance, every dismissive laugh was like a stone placed on Zahara's heart. Yet through it all, she remained kind, never speaking ill of Thandiwe, never showing anger in return. She believed that one day, her patience would win over the woman who despised her. She hoped love would soften a hard heart. But deep inside, Zahara also knew that storms don't always pass quietly, and some hearts are not easily chained. It was this unspoken tension that walked with her into her wedding day, a shadow waiting to rise in the middle of her joy. The courtyard was alive with color. Bright African fabrics stretched across the place like a sea of rainbows. Women wore dresses stitched with bold patterns of red, yellow, blue, and green, their necks heavy with beads that shimmered under the sunlight. Men clapped and stamped their feet as drummers struck the skins with a rhythm that made the ground vibrate. The air smelled of roasted meat and spiced stew, carried on the breeze along with the sound of laughter and song. Children darted between the legs of dancing adults, their tiny anklets jingling in time with the music. It was not just a wedding, it was a festival of life. All eyes turned when Zahara appeared. She walked slowly, glowing like a queen, her gown a blend of white silk and golden embroidery that caught every ray of light. Around her waist hung a belt of beads made by the women of Lasanda village, a gift from her mother. On her head rested a delicate crown of cowrie shells and gold threads, each step she took making it sparkle. Zahara's smile was gentle, but her eyes shone with something deeper, hope, love, and a quiet courage. Guests gasped at her beauty, and some even clapped as she passed, their voices rising in song to honor her. Yet not everyone celebrated. Seated at the front, Madame Thandiwe's face was stiff, her eyes cold and sharp. While others rose to their feet in admiration, she remained seated, her hands folded tightly on her lap. She did not clap. She did not smile. Her gaze followed Zahara like a shadow, reminding her that joy was not hers to claim easily. The guests noticed. Whispers spread through the crowd like wind through grass. Some leaned toward each other, murmuring, "Why does the mother not smile?" Others shook their heads, pitying Zahara, but too polite to say more. The tension was quiet, but heavy, wrapping itself around the celebration like an invisible chain. Still, the music carried on, the drums beating louder as if trying to drown out the silence sitting in Madame Thandiwe's heart. Zahara felt it too. She had dreamed of this moment, of walking proudly to her groom with her heart full, but she could feel the weight of her mother-in-law's eyes pressing on her back. For a moment her smile trembled, but then she lifted her chin. She told herself she was not just walking for herself, but for every woman who had ever been looked down on for being poor, for every daughter who had been told she was not enough. With each step, she pushed the sadness deeper inside, covering it with grace. The ceremony moved forward with music and dancing, but beneath the joy there was an unease, a quiet sense that something was waiting to break. And while the crowd clapped and cheered, Zahara knew that her biggest test was not the vows ahead, but the silent battle with the woman watching her every move. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally came. The drummers slowed their beat, the singers lowered their voices, and the elder stood to bless the couple before the vows. Zahara's hands trembled slightly in Kabelo's, but her heart was steady. She looked at him and felt a rush of love, a feeling that this was the beginning of everything they had dreamed of. The guests leaned forward, eager to hear the sacred words that would bind the two together. Laughter and dancing gave way to silence and reverence. But just as the elder opened his mouth to speak, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Wait!" It was Madame Thandiwe. Her tone was heavy, commanding, like a drumbeat that silenced the entire courtyard. All eyes turned to her. She rose slowly from her seat, her face unreadable, her hands resting firmly on her walking stick. The air seemed to freeze. Zahara's heart jumped in her chest, already fearing what was coming. Thandiwe's eyes locked on Zahara, cold and piercing. "Before this marriage continues," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "this girl must prove she has respect. If you truly want to be my son's wife, kneel before me and kiss my feet. Show me today that you know your place, or this wedding ends here." Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Women covered their mouths, men shook their heads, children stopped fidgeting and stared wide-eyed. The drummers froze with their hands in the air, unsure if they should play. It was as if the world itself had stopped spinning. The elder shifted uncomfortably, caught between tradition and the cruelty of the demand. Zahara's body stiffened. Her throat went dry, her palms cold. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her skin, waiting to see what she would do. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the whispers around her. Some people murmured, "She must kneel, or the marriage will be ruined." Others whispered with pity, "How can a mother shame her son's bride like this?" Kabelo stood frozen beside her, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. It was as though the weight of his mother's command had chained him in place. For Zahara, the moment stretched like eternity. Her mind raced. Should she lower herself to the ground, kiss the dust at her mother-in-law's feet, and save her marriage? Or should she stand tall and risk losing everything she had hoped for? She thought of her mother's proud face, of her father's words echoing from the past, and of the love she held for Kabelo. Tears burned her eyes, not from weakness but from the cruel choice forced upon her. The wedding that had been filled with joy was now hanging by a single fragile thread. The music, the laughter, the celebration, all of it faded into silence as the bride faced the most painful decision of her life. Zahara stood there, her chest rising and falling as the world around her blurred. The demand from Madame Thandiwe echoed in her ears like a curse. "Kneel and kiss my feet, or lose your marriage." Every whisper in the crowd stabbed at her heart, but louder than all of them was a voice from her memory. Her father's voice. He had been gone for years, yet in that moment he felt closer than ever. She could almost see him sitting under the old mango tree in Lasanda, his weathered hands holding hers as he said, "My daughter, remember this. A woman who bows to humiliation loses herself. Respect is precious, but it is never taken by force, it is given by choice." Her throat tightened, her eyes filled, and warm tears slipped down her cheeks. They were not tears of weakness, but of a soul struggling between love and dignity. She wanted to scream, to ask why life was so cruel to her on the very day meant for her joy. But she stayed silent, swallowing the pain like fire in her chest. She thought of Kabelo, standing frozen beside her, the man who had promised to protect her. She thought of her mother, sitting somewhere in the crowd, proud and hopeful. And then she thought of herself, the little girl who once sold tomatoes in the dust of Lasanda Market, who carried baskets heavier than her shoulders, who dreamed of love that would lift her beyond poverty. That girl, she knew, did not survive so much only to kneel in shame. Her knees trembled, not from willingness, but from the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. She felt the ground calling her to sink, to surrender, to give her pride away for peace. But then she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, her lips barely moving. God, give me strength. Let me stand. Let me not break today. Her voice was so soft only she could hear it, but in her heart it roared like thunder. The silence in the courtyard stretched painfully. Some guests leaned forward, expecting her to bend. Others sat back, waiting for a fight. The drummers stared at their instruments, afraid to play even a single note. Zahara's tears kept falling, tracing lines down her glowing cheeks. But behind those tears was something stronger than anger, resolve. She would cry, yes, but she would not crawl. When she opened her eyes again, she lifted her chin slightly. She did not speak. She did not move. She only stood there, still and steady, her tears falling onto her dress like drops of glass. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing the fire hidden behind her silence. She was breaking on the inside, but her spirit refused to bow. And though nothing had been decided yet, everyone could feel it. Zahara's tears were not a sign of defeat. They were the beginning of a storm. The silence stretched so long that it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Zahara's tears still glistened on her cheeks, but her face no longer trembled. Slowly, with steady steps, she let go of Kabelo's hand. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she moved away from the altar. Some thought she was walking out of the wedding. Others whispered frantically, wondering what she would do. But Zahara's steps were calm, her posture upright, as if unseen hands were guiding her. She walked to her seat where her crown rested, the crown that marked her as the bride, the symbol of honor for the day she had dreamed of since childhood. The crown glittered softly, its cowrie shells and gold threads catching the sunlight. For a moment, she looked at it with sadness, her fingers brushing it gently, as if saying goodbye. Then, with quiet strength, she lifted it and carried it toward Madame Thandiwe. The crowd leaned forward, their eyes wide. When Zahara reached the front, she did not kneel. Instead, she bent gracefully, set the crown on the ground before her mother-in-law's feet, and stepped back. Her voice was calm, but it carried through the courtyard like a song. If respect means breaking myself, then keep your crown. But love does not demand humiliation. The words cut deeper than any insult could. They were not shouted, not angry, just true. Every syllable was soaked in dignity. The courtyard went completely still. Even the drummers lowered their hands and dared not touch their drums. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind against the fabrics hanging overhead. Thandiwe's eyes widened, shocked that Zahara had not obeyed, but also stunned that she had not shouted or cursed. The guests shifted, murmuring quietly among themselves. Some placed their hands over their mouths in awe, others nodded slowly, as if realizing they were witnessing something greater than a wedding. Zahara stood tall, her tears still visible, but no longer signs of weakness. She was no longer just a bride in that moment. She was a woman choosing dignity over fear. Her words lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. She had given up her crown, the symbol of her joy, yet she had kept something far more precious, her self-respect. The silence was so thick it pressed on everyone's chest. Kabelo's eyes filled with conflict and pain as he looked at the crown lying at his mother's feet, the symbol of what his bride had refused to sacrifice. The elder bowed his head, as if humbled by Zahara's courage. Children in the crowd, who didn't fully understand what had happened, clung tighter to their mothers, sensing the weight of the moment. And there Zahara stood unbroken, her heart steady. The wedding had paused, the celebration had frozen, but her spirit had spoken louder than any drum. Everyone knew this day would not be remembered for the vows alone, but for the bride who refused to kneel. The moment Zahara's words settled in the air, the courtyard broke into restless whispers. It was as if her crown on the ground had cracked open the crowd itself. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others nodded with pride, and the space between them filled with arguments spoken in hurried tone. "She is too bold," one old woman muttered, fanning herself nervously. "How can a bride speak this way on her wedding day? A wife must show respect to her husband's mother." But another woman nearby shook her head firmly. "No, respect is not crawling in the dust. That girl is brave. I have never seen anyone stand against Madame Thandiwe like." The murmurs spread like wildfire. Some guests leaned forward in shock, whispering that Zahara had embarrassed herself. Others sat back with admiration, their eyes shining as if they had just seen history being made. The drummers still held their hands above the skins of their drums, unsure if they should strike or stay frozen. Even the children, usually too restless to sit still, stared wide-eyed, sensing that something serious was happening. At the center of it all stood Kabelo. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight, and his eyes darted between his mother and his bride. He loved Zahara with all his heart, but he had grown up under Thandiwe's strong hand. Her word had always been final, her authority unquestioned. Now he was caught in a storm he had never imagined, one that forced him to choose between the woman who gave him life and the woman he wanted to spend his life with. His silence was heavy. Some guests whispered that Kabelo must side with his mother, because tradition demanded it. Others whispered that if he loved Zahara, he should defend her dignity. The tension in the air was so sharp it felt like it could cut through skin. Zahara stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, her crown lying at her mother-in-law's feet, like an unspoken challenge. She had said what needed to be said, and now she waited, calm, silent, and steady. Though her heart raced inside her chest, her face showed no fear. Madame Thandiwe's expression darkened. She sat rigidly, her eyes blazing at the young woman who had dared to defy her in front of everyone. Her pride had been wounded, her control questioned. Yet even in her anger, she could not rise to strike back immediately. Zahara's words hung in the air like a shield around her, protecting her in a way no one could explain. The crowd held its breath. Some guests began softly murmuring prayers for peace. Others fanned themselves as if the heat of the moment was too much. The once joyful celebration now felt like a battlefield, with no song, no drum, no laughter able to break the weight of the silence. Everyone knew that whatever happened next would change everything, not only for Zahara and Kabelo, but for the whole family watching in stunned silence. The silence was crushing. Everyone waited, eyes shifting between Zahara's calm figure and Madame Thandiwe's cold, furious stare. But it was Kabelo who held the heaviest weight. His hands trembled at his sides, his chest rising and falling with the burden of a decision no groom should have to make on his wedding day. For years, he had been his mother's pride, the son she molded with strict words and a firm hand. But standing before him now was the woman who had given him her whole heart, the woman who had just laid down her crown rather than bow in shame. His soul ached, torn clean in two. Finally, he took a deep breath and stood. The wooden chair behind him scraped against the floor, the sound sharp in the tense silence. All eyes locked on him. Zahara looked at him with tear-filled eyes, searching for her answer. Thandiwe leaned forward, her gaze burning into her son, expecting him to put the girl in her place. The crowd hushed completely, even the babies quiet in their mother's arms. Kabelo's voice came low at first, but steady. "Mother," he said, his eyes fixed on Thandiwe. "Enough." The single word cut through the air like a blade. The crowd shifted uneasily. Then he lifted his chin higher, his voice growing stronger. "If a wife must kneel to you in shame, then I do not deserve her love. I choose Zahara, not your pride." For a second, the courtyard was still, as if no one dared believe what they had just heard. Then, like thunder breaking after a long silence, the applause erupted. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even shouting with joy. Women ululated loudly, their high-pitched cries piercing the sky. Men stamped their feet to the rhythm of the drums, which had finally come alive again. It was as though the wedding had been pulled back from the edge of ruin and thrust into glory. Zahara's knees weakened with relief, her hands flying to her face as tears poured freely. But this time, they were tears of love, of gratitude, of being chosen without hesitation. Kabelo stepped toward her, his eyes filled with fire and devotion, and placed his hand firmly in hers, holding her like he would never let go. Madame Thandiwe, however, trembled in her seat. Her lips pressed so tightly together they turned white, her fingers clenched around her walking stick. Rage flashed across her face, not only at Zahara, but at her own son who had dared to stand against her in public. The authority she had worn like a crown all her life was slipping away, and she could feel it. The cheering grew louder, the joy of the crowd drowning out her fury. The wedding that had nearly collapsed was alive again, but this time stronger, because Kabelo had made his choice clear. He had chosen love over pride, dignity over fear, and Zahara over everyone else. The applause still echoed when an old man at the front slowly rose to his feet. He was one of the respected elders of the village, his back bent with age, but his voice still strong enough to command a room. The cheering quieted as people turned to him, curious about what he would say. He leaned on his wooden staff, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before settling firmly on Madame Thandiwe. "Enough of this," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "Respect is earned, not forced. A true mother does not shame her son's bride on the day of her marriage. What you have asked today is not respect, it is humiliation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Madame Thandiwe stiffened, her face tightening as though she had been slapped. But the elder was not finished. He turned toward Zahara, his eyes softening. "This girl you look down on," he said, "is the same one who once saved me. Years ago, I had nothing. I was starving in the market, with no coin in my hand. Zahara, still a young woman, placed food in my hands and said, 'Eat, elder. Hunger should not kill you while I have something to give.' She asked nothing in return. That is respect. That is dignity. That is the heart of a true wife." The guests gasped, many nodding as they remembered similar moments. One woman stood and lifted her hand. "It is true. She once carried my baby when I fainted in the sun and waited until I woke." Another man added loudly, "And when my child was sick, she gave me herbs from her own garden. She never asked for payment." Voices rose one after another, each sharing a memory of Zahara's kindness. "She is humble. She is strong. She honors people, even when she is hurt." The chorus of testimonies grew louder, filling the courtyard until there was no room for doubt. All eyes returned to Thandiwe, whose face burned with shame. Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. The stories surrounded her like walls closing in, leaving her no place to stand. Her authority, once unshakable, crumbled under the weight of truth. With trembling hands, she gripped her walking stick and pushed herself to her feet. Her body shook with rage, her pride wounded before the very people who once feared her. Without another word, Madame Thandiwe turned sharply and stormed out of the wedding. Her steps were hard and angry, her back stiff as if she were trying to hold on to the last shred of her dignity. The crowd watched in silence as she disappeared through the gates, her absence leaving behind both relief and a strange emptiness. Then, slowly, the drummers began to play again. The guests clapped, voices rising in renewed joy. The storm had passed, and Zahara stood taller than ever. Not because she had fought with anger, but because she had endured with grace, and the truth had spoken for her. The courtyard slowly came back to life after Thandiwe stormed out. The drums started again, this time louder, stronger, as though they were celebrating not just a wedding but a victory. Guests rose to their feet, singing and clapping, their voices echoing through the sky. The air felt lighter, free from the shadow that had tried to ruin the day. Smiles returned, and the wedding once again glowed with joy. The elders stepped forward, their hands raised for silence. One of them lifted the crown Zahara had placed on the ground, brushed it gently, and looked at her with pride. "It is not for one person to decide your worth," he said. "Today, the community itself crowns you." Together, the elders placed the crown back on Zahara's head, not as a symbol of submission, but of honor. Kabelo was crowned too, his hand clasped tightly in hers, the two of them standing side by side as equal. The guests erupted in cheers. Women sang high-pitched ululations. Men beat the drums until the ground shook, and children danced with bare feet slapping against the dust. They were no longer just celebrating a marriage. They were celebrating courage, dignity, and love that refused to bow to pride. Zahara's smile was full and radiant, her eyes shining with tears of relief and triumph. Kabelo looked at her as though he had been given the rarest gift of his life. And as the music filled the air, a final truth settled in the hearts of everyone present. That day, Zahara taught them all something unforgettable: love without respect is slavery. And sometimes standing tall is the greatest kneeling one can do.